Hello, everyone, and welcome to Youth Positively Speaking. My name is Paige Ewing, and I work at Prevention Resources as the Multimedia Specialist for Positive Youth. Prevention Resources is a nonprofit located in New Jersey that is dedicated to promoting health and wellness of individuals, families, and community through education, collaboration, advocacy, and treatment. We are super excited to have a new partnership between Positive Youth and the Hunterdon County Partnership for Health to bring you this mental health mini-series. So for those of you who are new to the podcast, the Positive Youth Initiative is focused on building countywide capacity to reduce substance misuse among youth 9 to 20 years old in Hunterdon County. And the Hunterdon County Partnership for Health is a community collaboration dedicated to achieving optimal health for all residents. So today we have with us Erin Cohen. Erin, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Erin Cohen, and I am coming on as the parent perspective today on this, talking about anxiety. I have 3 boys at home, a senior and junior in high school, and also a 6th grader.
And then we also have with us the lovely Lynne. Lynne, why don't you introduce yourself as well?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Lynne Gonski. I work with Hunterdon Behavioral Health at Hunterdon Medical Center, and I'm the coordinator of the school-based program. There, we provide supportive counseling services to kids throughout Hunterdon County.
So today, as Erin mentioned, we're really going to be talking about youth mental health on this entire series. And today specifically, we're going to be talking about anxiety. We know that post-COVID anxiety has risen, but even before COVID, there was a lot of anxiety in our youth. So we're going to be talking about what exactly it is, what should we be looking for, and then as adults or parents and people who help youth, what should we do if we identify anxiety in our youth? So Lynne, as our expert on this episode, can you tell us a little bit about what is anxiety? We talk about it all the time, and I'm anxious. Oh, they're anxious. But what does that even mean?
So I think one of the important distinctions is between having a nervous day or being nervous about a particular thing, and anxiety is a syndrome. So we all, kids and parents alike, feel nervous about an upcoming presentation, feel stressed about flying if you don't like to fly. But anxiety as a syndrome is different. Anxiety as a syndrome contains a cluster of symptoms, and it goes on for a period of several weeks or more. So you know, the difference would be, so she's stressed about a presentation, she can't eat breakfast, she's pacing, she's wringing her hands on the bus, maybe texting the parent. She does the presentation and then she recovers. She goes to lunch, she has a good time with her friends, a good school day, good weekend. Anxiety as a syndrome is that a kid is worried a lot across situations. They're worried at home that something's going to happen. They're worried at school. They feel nervous in the hallway. They have heightened physical reactions. They'll complain that their heart's pounding a lot. They often complain that their stomach hurts when they're angry. Sometimes kids have to use anxious. Sometimes kids have to use the bathroom a lot when they get anxious. You'll see cognitive changes with the syndrome. So kids worry excessively about things that an outsider would say, I'm not sure how you're getting there. They do a lot of what ifs. What if this happens? What if that happens? And they're consumed with these things to the point where other places in their life take a bit of a backseat. They're not able to focus on schoolwork. They're not able to go to the sleepover because they're worried about that. Friendships often suffer because anxious kids tend to seek reassurance a lot. Do you still like me? Are you mad at me? You didn't say anything. So that bothers bothers their peers. So you see these physical and cognitive symptoms pervasive, and you see them impacting the kid's life in many places across the board.
And I can imagine that's hard to sometimes identify because especially with our youth now, there's so much for them to be worried about. And so it's like, you know, in our current climate, we're in the post-COVID world, but it's flu and cold season now. So it's that, oh, I'm sick. Is it COVID? Oh, you know, like right now we have a lot of school shootings when we go into schools. Is that something they're worrying about? And then you have tests, homework, all the clubs and everything like that. So it can be really overwhelming and hard, I think, for parents to say, is this just normal stress or is this anxiety when so much is going on?
And so, Paige, I think there's two things to that. I think one is that that in the case of, yeah, you're right, and Biden's talked about Armageddon, and there's all kinds of things in the news that are very, very scary in addition to what you said. So I think that there's two things here to consider. One is that kids with an anxiety syndrome or an anxiety clinical issue can't let it go. So the rest of us say, oh boy, I heard it's going to be a bad flu season. And then we say, what's on Netflix tonight? And we're able to relax and enjoy the movie. These kids can't let it go. And I think that begins to become obvious. The other thing that's important is I worry sometimes that parents are too inclined to say, well, that's just being a teenager. And I think we need to trust our guts there. That's true with anxiety. It's true with depression. If you keep seeing something, and if you have to keep saying that's just being a teenager, maybe it's not. Maybe if you have to keep saying that, maybe you're seeing it enough that it's more than just typical teenage stuff.
So also, as a parent, if I'm seeing my son act a certain way and I can kind of see it as an anxious event, when you were talking about what anxiety is, one of my sons used to wrestle, and he was in a weight class that didn't have a lot of matches. So he didn't wrestle a lot. Basically, he would get these forfeits because he was in a really light weight class. Mm-hmm. But then I saw that when he would have matches, he got to the point where he was so anxious, he couldn't do anything.
Yeah.
And I can remember him, my stomach hurts. And he couldn't identify it. And it actually took me a little bit of time where I thought, oh, wait, is he having anxiety around this because he's not used to this? And actually it got to the point where he couldn't even function anymore wrestling and had to stop wrestling because he couldn't figure out how to manage it, but he didn't even identify it as anxiety. Mm-hmm. And so as the parent, I was starting to question, same thing like what you just said, oh, it's just normal. It's this match. This is why he's feeling this way. But then I started seeing that he was like basically kind of shutting down. Yeah. So I do think it's pretty, the parents really need to kind of watch and see because to me, I was like, this is completely not normal behavior for him. And I don't understand what's happening. And he didn't know what was going on.
Right. That's a good point, Erin. I think the parents do kids a favor when they help identify it, certainly for younger kids, sometimes even for older kids. Sometimes younger kids feel this way all the time, and all they think is there's something wrong with me, which makes them more anxious. And I think that parents do kids a benefit when they help kids say, I wonder if you're struggling with something else here. I don't think there's anything wrong with you, but I wonder if you're struggling with this issue. Mm-hmm. And P.S., I have to say this, I really want to encourage the use of that phrase, are you struggling with, instead of do you have anxiety? Because I hate that kids come in and they say to me, I have anxiety. And I don't like that because it makes that problem as much a part of them as their height and their eye color. And that gets in affiliating with the issue and taking it onto you makes it very hard to work on it as a problem. I much prefer that parents say, I've been noticing these things. I wonder if you're struggling with this. When you say struggling, it takes it apart from the kid, it puts it on the table as a problem. They can see it, you can see it. Now we have something we can tackle. But getting back to the point, I think that parents do kids a benefit when they say, I wonder if you're struggling with this. And even for teenagers, sometimes, teenagers are very quick to, self-blame. And sometimes they think there must be something wrong with me. So I think it is good for parents to just question it and have a conversation about that.
Yeah. I'm actually really glad that you just said that, because I feel like everybody now is always like, I have anxiety, and everybody has anxiety. And what you were talking about before with the presentations, I've never been someone who's an anxious person, but you know what, before a presentation, I always feel anxious myself. And, situational, where you're nervous about something. I'm glad that you kind of talked about that distinction, because I think that the line is really blurred with what actually anxiety is, and then what you could be potentially nervous about.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's one of the I won't say it's a downfall of psychology, but when you talk about things like like physics and chemistry, well, you don't read about that in popular literature because nobody understands that stuff, right? But when you talk about psychology, findings are everywhere. Things are everywhere. We have things on school websites, which is fine. And we have things in newspapers and in on the radio. And I think because it's psychology, people feel that they understand it. So I think they glom too quickly on, well, I have this. And I think partly when kids say I have it, I think that's kind of keeps them from doing the work they need to do to move past it. Right. It's like me saying, well, I'm 5'3", and that's just the way it is. They say, well, I'm anxious. That's the way it is. So I think it is good to put that as something they're struggling with.
So what are some things that as a parent I can do for my kids? And I guess it would be different between my 6th grader who's a middle schooler and my senior in high school. What can I do to help them in these instances where they're experience a lot of anxiety?
Right. So I think the first thing is to, like we said, identify it as is this something you're struggling with, and to normalize that. We all struggle, kids and adults alike struggle with moods at different points in our lives. So to normalize it. And then I think to make it clear, there's stuff we could try to help this. I think I'm a big fan of the idea that if for anxiety, depression, irritability, I'm a big fan of the idea that if you want to feel different, you have to think differently much of the time. One thing I don't like, I don't like the signs that you sometimes see in counseling offices is that all thoughts and feelings are valid. I hate that. I think what they mean to say is we're going to listen to you, whatever you have to say. But the idea that all thoughts and feelings are valid, I don't buy it. I think thoughts are often incredibly error prone and often erroneous. Thoughts are capricious. And so I have a sign in my office that says, in fact, don't believe everything you think. So I think something that we can do to help kids who are struggling with anxiety is talk to them about, can you give me a sense about what's going through your mind at the time this happens? And they'll tell you, well, I figure everybody's staring right at my clothes because I don't have the right clothes. And then they think I'm weird. And then you have something to work on. Then you can say to the kid, next time you go, and I like to phrase it with kids as an experiment. Because kids, that intrigues people, right? When you say, could you try an experiment? And that kind of sticks in people's head. Try to notice the next time somebody's speaking, how many people are really looking at her and how many are really looking at their phones. Do some reality testing, right? Because the truth is they're probably looking at their phones. Then the kid says, wow, I was thinking this, I was totally wrong, which helps to calm the mood down.
And I know for me, so when I was in college, I had really, really strong anxiety feelings all the time, to the point where one day in class, I had a panic attack and I had to leave class, and all my friends came out and they were like, okay, are you okay? And I was like, no, I'm not okay. And so I started going to therapy. When I started going to therapy, obviously I told my parents because it was going on our insurance, and my parents were like, okay, thank you so much for telling us, that's totally fine, whatever you need to do. But it was actually a few hours later that my dad sent me a really nice email. And he was like, I don't know when you want to talk about this or if you ever want to talk about this, but just know I have anxiety too. And I actually take medication for my anxiety, and I've gone to therapy for it too. So you're not alone in this. And if you ever want to talk about it to commiserate, I'm here. And I've never talked to my dad about it because I never felt like I had to, but just knowing that he also was kind of in the same kind of storm of this feeling, it was like, well, why didn't you tell me that earlier? Maybe I would have gotten help earlier.
Right.
And I think it's so important, then I graduated from therapy and then COVID happened and everything. So then I went back and I felt so ashamed that I had to go back. But then I talked to other people and they're like, why? This is a good thing, you're getting help. And so I think it's so important that parents talk to their kids and kids talk to their parents about the things that they're feeling and the thoughts that they're having, because maybe, we're all in the same boat and we could kind of help each other feel more normal about it.
Yes, Paige, I think that every high school kid needs 10 sessions, myself, and I think that all adults probably need 10 sessions. It is so good just to have somebody to talk to. And another thing that you said that I think is important in terms of kids getting the help that they need once you identify it, is if kids are going to get the help, and you mentioned the insurance, they're going to have to go to parents, and they're only going to go to parents if parents can do one magical thing. please don't flip. Your parents did the perfect thing because you felt that you could tell them. And when you told them, they didn't flip on you. They said, hey, we're really glad to know that. And so please, when your kids tell you stuff, don't dismiss it. Don't say it's normal teenage stuff. Let me tell you something. If a 12-year-old comes to you and says, I think I have this problem, they may have the problem because 12-year-olds don't do that. That's so not cool, right? For a 12-year-old to go to a parent and be vulnerable. If they hang around the kitchen island a lot, kind of talking about stuff, pay attention to that because kids don't normally do that. And then your job as a parent is not to flip out because this is, like you said, Paige, this is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. We try to teach kids self-advocacy. And then when they come to us with something, suddenly the door shuts. I never get that. We always teach kids, go talk to your teachers, tell your teachers what you think. And then when they tell us stuff, we're like, la, 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 I don't want to hear it.
Right.
I don't quite get that, you know? So I think that we should model how to be an advocate for kids for themselves, to say that when they say to parents, you know, I wonder about this, have the conversation. There's nothing wrong with it and everything right about it.
Can I ask a question about anxiety, and is it hereditary? Because when Paige was just mentioning about her dad, and I was thinking, you know, if my husband has anxiety, does that make my children more prone to anxiety?
Mm-hmm. So I think that, and again, I'm not a medical person, but from what I understand about it is, I don't believe that there's a specific gene for it. I think that anxiety and depression are probably based in many multiple genes of small effects, right? So my understanding is that there's not a gene for that, but I think from what I've read, there probably are heritable traits that cause people to run hot, be kind of hot wired. There are probably tendencies that people are born with that make them react to provocations with us in a certain way. I think there's probably also, you know, it could be things that have happened to them. It could be, you know, if a kid sees an anxious parent all the time, they may learn some anxiety through that. But I don't, and you know, Erin, I don't mind saying that some of these traits can be biological traits, not a gene for it, but there can be tendencies to run hot, because we have to remember that just because something is biological, or if it were to be biological, doesn't mean that it's immutable. It doesn't mean it's unfixable. Sometimes people like to say, well, that's just a biological thing, therefore you're stuck. That's not true at all. There's all kinds of people are born with diabetes type 1, and we treat that. So,
Right.
so there's all kinds of things that people can be born wired for, but it's still very changeable.
Yeah, I think we talk a lot about that, like in prevention, especially because we talk about substance use disorder a lot. And, you know, that whole idea of like, well, my parents, had a substance use disorder, so I'm damned to have one too. And
Right.
it's like, well, no, there's so many factors that go into, we talk about risk and protective factors for a kid, even if they live in a household that maybe their parents do have anxiety, depression, something like that. But then they're involved in sports and they have awesome coaches and they
Right.
have clubs and things like that. That helps kind of negate maybe that more anxious environment that they're in. And then they never end up having a clinical anxiety.
Yeah, Paige, that's an excellent point. A kid could be raised by parents who are very anxious all the time, but they could have these other protective factors that you mentioned, sports, and maybe they have better friends than their parents had. But the other thing is that you're not living, you tell the kid, in the age that your parents did. We know much more about mental wellness, emotional wellness. We talk more about it. We're much more open about it than we were a generation ago. So that's another important thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, the other thing too that is a huge concern for me is social media with my kids and just teens just in general. And I find that causes so much more anxiety. So what can we do as parents? Because it's inevitable. It's inevitable that our kids are going to get on social media at some point. What is it that we can do as parents to help them?
Right. So, Erin, that's the $1,000 or $1 million question.
Yeah.
I agree 1000%. The social media is driving a lot of this anxiety. In the olden days, you could have stuff going on at school, but the kid goes home and they're ensconced by their family and they're in this safe place. Now you have, Susie at home and she's in her jammies on her bed and somebody texts her, "You're ugly," on a social media app. So
Right.
they're never protected from it. Now I'm going to say this, even noting that, I'm not a fan of removing kids' social media completely. Here's the thing. This is the water that they swim in.
Right.
And trying to protect kids from this water that they swim in is like putting a wetsuit on a porpoise, right? Like, they're already in the water. So they have to, and it also, not having access to this stuff puts them out of touch with their peers, which is really, really damaging. So I think that parenting today, I'm glad mine are older. It's really, really hard. I think that parents have to do a lot of education in the home about not only appropriate use, but educating kids on how this impacts their mood. I think parents should encourage kids to take brief hiatuses from social media. I have teenagers who say they went to the mountains, they had no service, they loved it. Like once they try it, they like it. And I think it's important for parents to tie kids' sad and anxious moods to, let's talk about where this started. This really goes back to Susie's comment and to kind of talk about that. So the social media makes it very hard. In a very real way, social media was supposed to bring us together, and it's really pulled us apart in a lot of ways.
And I see
Yeah,
that
and
a lot.
I think, oh,
go ahead.
Sorry, Paige.
I was going to say, I see that a lot of so my sister, she's a senior in college now. And every once in a while, I'll Snapchat her, send her something on Instagram. I'll be like, "Did you see that? You never replied." And she's like, "Oh, I just deleted it." I was like, "Oh, really?" And she's like, "Yeah, I just didn't want to deal with all this stuff on social media anymore. So I took a break." And she's like, "I'll let you know when I'm back on." And then the other day I got a snap from her and I was like, "Oh, I guess she's back on Snapchat." And I was like, that's amazing to just be like, I'm going to cut myself off. Like, I don't want to deal with this anymore. And I think that more and more young people are doing that, where they're just like, "No, I'm good. Thanks. Bye." Because I don't want to deal with that.
I like too that social media has changed a little bit. There's that new app called Be Real, because I think kids were seeing all these filters and things were fake. And this new Be Real app basically takes a picture of you and your environment, because sometimes people stage things and they do certain angles so it looks perfect.
Right.
And I see what my kids are doing and what their friends will post too. And it kind of makes me excited about it, because then they're seeing just real stuff and they're not seeing these filters and the clean space, or, oh, everything's perfect. And I think they're craving that, like you said, and
Agreed.
with your sister, they're craving just kind of like real life at this point.
Yes, that sounds very cool. I actually haven't heard of that one, but I think that's great to say, this is me in my room and it's an absolute mess, know, and so I think kids need that, but I think all this social media has driven anxiety because it forces so much focus on the self. I read this one quote, I forget where I read it, and this guy said, "Do you know why we call it a selfie? Because it takes too long to say narcissistic." I mean, these kids are just constantly looking at themselves, and anybody who would look at themselves long enough, you're going to find some kind of fault. And again, like Erin, like you said, that kids are driven to put out this you can use Photoshop to do anything you want. You can brush stuff. You can so I think it's a tremendous driver of anxiety. So we're in a quandary, right? So these apps drive anxiety, but we also don't want to take kids out of the world that they live in. So it really is going to me, the biggest thing is going to be communication with your kid as beginning 8 and up, when they start to become preteens. A lot of communication, about responsible use of social media, B, about helping them see what this does, helping them see the impacts of that.
And I know that you just mentioned 8-year-olds, and I think that's something that's so important. A lot of adults get kind of wary about, like elementary school kids. We should be having these conversations about social media, about mental health, really, really young. I'm like, let's talk to kindergartners, like let's talk to young kids, because then as they grow up and as they encounter more issues with all of this, then they feel more comfortable talking about it. And so like that's why I'm so excited that like we have our prevention educators here at Prevention Resources, and they go into schools, elementary, middle, high, and they talk about the same things, you know, age appropriate, but same things all the way through, because then it just makes it normal to talk about these issues, so that when something does come up, it's not a scary thing to talk about.
100%. Yeah, I agree with that. The sooner we get them swimming in this verbiage, these topics, the more normal it becomes and the easier you can talk about it. But then remember, so we want to be sure as parents that we keep pace with our young people. So our young people, just like the example we said before, our young people are now swimming in this world where this is so normal to talk about. We as parents have to step up our game and not freak out when they try to talk to us about this stuff. It's so important. If I had a nickel for every kid who told me, I talked to my parents about my anxiety, but they'd freak, I'd be retired already. I'd be on an island somewhere. You know, kids are afraid because the parents, but my message to the parents is, this is nothing to be afraid of. It's extremely, extremely treatable. It's a very common problem. It's very treatable. I mean, I'm trying to think of something else. It's very funny how there's this disconnect between physical issues and emotional, right? So when the dentist says your kid has a cavity and you have to get it filled, we don't hesitate to do that. Well, that's a problem. I'm going to fix that problem so it doesn't get worse. And yet when your kids struggle with anxiety, we don't do the same. I don't get the disconnect, you know, so
I think it's people can't see it. My husband has said that to me for years,
right.
You know, with mental illness, you know, in his family, there's some mental illness, and people see what the behavior that the person does, and they, you know, get really upset by that. And he says all the time, he's like, okay, something is wrong. It's no different than cancer or a broken leg. You're not going to not fix it. And
Right.
so, you know, we have to look at it that way too. I will say, I do have a question about, I always hear anxiety and depression kind of hand in hand. If you have anxiety, does it always mean that you're going to be depressed?
Not at all. Not at all. They are close country cousins, and many people who have one have the other. And I imagine that's because they can both be driven by the same types of things: excessive rumination, excessive self-focus, excessive self-blame. That can lead to both of those. But I have kids who have one and not the other. So it's highly possible. I wouldn't want people to think that just because they have one, they're bound to get the other. Something else I was going to say in terms of parents helping kids get treatment, is one thing is I would refer to it not as a mental problem. And here's why. If parents say, well, I'm sorry you have this mental problem, that has a connotation from like the cuckoo's nest days, right?
Yeah.
Like that's a reference that not everybody gets, but you know, it has a very negative connotation. I like the word, you're struggling with something emotionally right now. You're kind of struggling with something in your head right now. It's the same way that, you know, people, when you work with high school kids, you don't use the word reputation. Would you worry about your reputation? You always say image. What is your image like? Because reputation is a very old-fashioned word. So I think that it's better to say, you know, are you struggling with this in your head a little bit? And kids go, yeah. If you were to say, do you have a mental problem? They say no. But you say, you're struggling a bit with it in your head? They say, yeah. The second thing I would encourage is parents not to use the word therapy, because therapy has unfortunately, a similarly negative connotation. I would say, what about we get a coach for this? Because here's the other pisser, is that kids are eager to get a basketball coach, or they want a tutor for the National Honor Society, but we don't get a life coach. We need coaches to help. And that's a good way to phrase it, because that's really obviously, if you go to therapy, you're getting real treatment. But in terms of getting kids buy-in, I think it's perfectly okay to say this therapist does coaching. She's going to coach you and help you get to a better place.
Yeah, I really like that a lot. I think that's a great turn of phrase. And I think that's a great way to get kids bought into it.
Right.
And I have to say, I'm so excited that we have this mini series now with the Partnership for Health. And I want to thank you so much, Lynne, for coming on today, for talking to us about anxiety. And I can't wait for our conversations in the future. I know that we're going to be talking about other topics just like this, maybe an episode talking about depression, an episode talking about something else. But it's all with the Partnership for Health. So we have to thank them so much for asking to join us and make this mini series. We just want to say, if you need more information and resources, please visit our website at njprevent.com/positive youth. And we want to thank you for listening in. We'll see you next time for more Youth Positively Speaking.